G'day everyone. Today we're going to be pulling the engine out of this 300ZX Z32. It's the V6 VG30DETT T. We'll go through every critical part we need to undo and remove out of the way in order to pull this engine and gearbox out as one. Of course, we're going to need an engine crane, we're going to need to be able to jack the vehicle up, and we need some basic tools in order to undo all the nuts and bolts that we are required to get this engine out. The idea is that we're going to pull the engine out and rebuild it step by step, so subscribe if you want to follow along with that process. But for now, let's get this ready to pull out. We'll go through every critical step we need to in order to remove this particular engine out of this particular car. Let's get started. All right, so we're going to start at the front of the engine. We're going to work all of the top stuff, and we're going to work from the front to the back. So the first thing we're taking off are these intake pipes, the two blue and the two black. The turbo model, this one here, has 4 pipes. The naturally aspirated model just has the 2 accordion pipes. Being the TT, we'll take all 4 off. Next, we move to the radiator. Now, there is a drain valve at the bottom if you want to drain the coolant. In my case, the car's cold. I'm just going to take the top hose off and capture any coolant in a container underneath the vehicle. Of course, if it's hot when we're doing this, be very careful. That will be pressurized. Make sure it cools down and you release the pressure before taking off any hoses. The shroud itself has a couple of 12mm head bolts holding it in at the top here. So we'll take those 2 12mm head bolts out, and then we can lean the shroud backwards. And there is a section at the bottom that allows us to lift the radiator out. There's a section at the bottom of the shroud that pops out without having to go underneath the car and take the bottom 2 bolts of the shroud out. The radiator itself has 2 12mm head bolts here holding brackets that hold the radiator down. So we'll take those 2 out and we'll put the bolts back in the holes that we took them out of so we can't lose them. And there is that section on the bottom there I was talking about earlier. Pop that out so you can just reach in and pop it out and pull it away. We can take that bottom hose out, and I'm taking it off at the engine side only. It holds a lot more coolant in the radiator, so we can tip that coolant out somewhere else. And we have an overflow pipe as well. Make sure we get that off at the top there next to the radiator cap. And then we can just lift the radiator out. It sits in 2 mounts at the bottom. We can just lift it out and pour any excess coolant out of the radiator. Of course, next we take the fan off. The fan is pretty straightforward. We don't really need to take it off, but it does get in the way for everything else. It's much easier to get that out of the way. We'll leave the viscous hub on, but we're getting the fan off. It's just a ring of bolts. We use a ratchet like I've done here, electric ratchet, or we can use a rattle gun if you can get in there. I'm going to remove a lot of these vacuum pipes. We're just going to take them off as we see them. Make sure you take photos or note where they are if you're not videoing it like I am. We just take any vacuum hoses off and any electrical parts we can just get to right now. We've got 2 coolant temperature sensors there. We have the CAS sensor, and if you have a PTU that is in the original location, that will also be plugged in on that camshaft cover. Now we're going to take the throttle cables out. We have to get rid of this cover on top. There are Allen head bolts on this cover, and there's one sneaky little 10mm bolt at the back there. We need to get that cover off, and then we can see we've got 2 cables. One is cruise control, and one is just the throttle from the pedal. We can loosen the 2 nuts on either side of the bracket. We don't need to take it all the way off. We just loosen the 2 nuts so we can get them cable out of the bracket. And then we can open the throttle in order to get the little soldered piece on the end of the cable out. And there is a bracket as well on the side of the intake plenum. We can get them 2 cables out of the way so we can do the rest of the job. Next up comes the balance tube. This is pretty straightforward as well. There's a lot of vacuum lines attached to the balance tube. Most of them just press on, and we have a series of nuts on the top. Most of my nuts were 12mm, one of them was 13. I don't know if that's standard, but most were 12, one was 13. We have a hose on the back we need to take off. That will have a clamp on it, and it'll be a little bit bigger than the rest of the vacuum hoses. And then we can just lift the balance tube away in order to get access to the rest of the wiring harness and the fuel lines as well. Now on these TT models, we do have a hard pipe sitting here that's mounted to the intake plenum. We have to get that out. Once again, that's a 12mm, I believe, and they're held in with clamps at the turbo end here. They're a little bit hard to get to. We can get in there with a little ratchet, in this case, an 8mm socket, and a little ratchet, small increments at a time, and we can get that clamp loose, and we can pull that hard line out. If you have an NA, this is not a problem, but with the twin turbo model, we do need to get this hard pipe out before we can get our main intake accordion pipes out. There's a clamp at either end of the accordion pipes. We can either get in there with a flat blade screwdriver or use a little ratchet. We also have these PCV hoses that need to come off. They're just a clamp and we can just pull them off with a pair of pliers. Once we get it to this point, we can pop the accordion hose out. They're pretty flexible. I'll probably give that a wash in the robo wash later. Of course, it's the same on the other side. We have one bolt holding the hard pipe to the intake plenum, and there's also a vacuum hose on this particular one that goes to our idle air control valve. And we can take this clamp off again. Once the battery's out, I do take the battery out a little bit later. Getting this clamp is much easier with a wobbly socket with the battery out of its location there. And of course we can pop that vacuum hose off however you need to. And we can take that clamp there. That's on the front of the accordion. Very hard to get to. Hopefully the last person left that clamp in a good spot, or you might struggle a little bit to get that clamp off the accordion pipe. Now the fuel lines, we have some small hard fuel lines on the top here where that balance tube was. We do need to get them out the way in order to get the rest of the wiring harness out. Now we have a feed from the filter and we have a return line there as well. So we just need to get these two lines off and we can remove all the hard lines. You can see here they're bolted down. So I'm going to go ahead and remove all the bolts in order to loosen up that hard line fuel system. I'm going to leave everything else intact. There's a couple of fuel intake areas there. We need to get them hoses off, and we take the main intake and return lines off them fuel lines. I've left the bolt in just one bolt there so we can pull against it, and I'm going to slide different hardware that I've got from my toolbox into those lines so we're not spilling fuel everywhere and stinking out the workshop. So we just clamp them up and they're sealed for good, and then we can lift the rest of these fuel lines off once we've taken the two clamps off the engine. Of course, try not to spill petrol everywhere like I just did. Then I'm going to put every bolt back where it came from so we don't forget. We put them all back in the holes, and that's an easy way to store them. Of course, next we can pull the wiring loom off. We'll unplug all of them coil packs. We'll unplug all the injectors, and there's an extra plug at the top there. I think there's a knock sensor or something at the top there we unplug, and we can get all of that wiring harness now out the way once that set of fuel lines is off. You can see here, we're just going to go ahead and unplug everything that's plugged in, unplug it, make notes of where the plugs go so you don't get confused when we're putting it back together. There is an earth there. There's a couple of earths on the back here. We need a 12mm socket and a little rattle gun. There's a couple of earths that are actually bolted to that intake plenum. And while I'm here, I'm just going to take that vacuum line off for the brake booster just because I happen to be here. The rest of the wiring loom, you can peel it back, have a look, make sure you haven't missed any plugs. There's a couple of oxy sensors there. There's another earth behind here as well. And there is the idle air control plug. That's the yellow one. And the gray one is for your idle up. When you have your air conditioning turned on, that will idle up your engine. And there is the earth I was just talking about. There's another one just there. We need to take that off, and we should have the wiring loom pretty much free of that intake plenum. And as for the battery, very straightforward. We just take the positive and negative terminals off, take off the clamp, and of course we just lift the battery out. Just be careful, it's a little bit heavy and a little bit awkward, but it comes out fairly straightforward. Next we have the air conditioning compressor. That has 4 bolts holding it in, the one at the front. There's a really tricky one at the back here. You can just see it down there in that hole. And there's 2 at the bottom as well. All of them are a 14mm socket. But first we do need to loosen up this pulley. We take the tension off the pulley here, and then underneath we can get a little 12mm, I believe, socket on it, and take the tension off the belt in order to get the belt off the air conditioner so we can remove the compressor itself. The bolt at the front came out easy. That's just a rattle gun and a 14mm. The one at the back, I used a crow's foot like this, going in from the front using a long extension. It's a little bit hard, but it's the best way to get in there if you don't have a spanner that'll fit. The 2 at the bottom, straightforward. We just use a rattle gun, an extension, and a 14mm socket. As for the power steering pump, there are 3 bolts you can see here. One is the lock for the tensioner. There's 2 others that hold that bracket on that I'm going to take off. And then there's 2 that sit behind the pulley itself. Now we do need to turn the pulley in order to get to those 2. That is slightly at the top next to each other. And we can turn the pulley with a 19mm spanner in order to line up the holes in the pulley with the bolts. So the first one is there. We've lined up the hole, and we'll take that 14mm head bolt out. And the second one is there. We've just advanced the pump a little bit, and it's right next door. So we take all of those out, 5 bolts in total, or 4 bolts and 1 nut. Take them all out, take the tension off the belt, and then this is how we take the tension off the belt. And then we can remove the belt, and the power steering pump will just sit there. As we lift the engine, it will come out of the way, as we go up and hoist the engine out of the engine bay. The same goes for the alternator. I do that at the end as well. So we're just going to take the tension off the alternator so we can remove the belt while we're underneath taking the tension off the power steering as well. It's the same idea. We just take the tension off with a 12mm socket. There's a pair of oil cooler lines here. Disconnect them there and they'll come out with the engine. There's also a pair of heater lines at the back. We take the hoses off and we just leave the hoses hanging there in the firewall, much like that. They can be a little bit rusty and awful, but we just take them off. The transmission itself, we will drain the oil out of the transmission and then we can remove the slave piston here. It's got a bolt and a nut in my case. I believe they were both 14mm. We can take the earth off the starter motor. You can see that there. We've taken that earth line off. And then we can remove the starter motor itself. There's 2 bolts holding that on. One at the bottom, we can just see there. And there's one at the top you can't see. There's only the 2 bolts with that earth off. And we unplug the small plug that's at the bottom. We can take the starter motor off and that gives us access to take off more wiring harness around the transmission. There's a few plugs and things here. Just take the plugs off as you see them. And then we can take the mounts off. And now we want to leave at least 1 bolt in either side. I've started taking the bolts off here. We can take off 2 of the bolts. Just make sure you leave 1 on either side because we're not ready to drop that transmission just yet. You can see at the top here, the shifter linkage is held up with a nut. And then I've got 2 other nuts holding this shifter on. And we can undo the shifter and drop the whole assembly out through the bottom of the car and take these 2 19mm bolts out for that center bearing. Now I left the prop shaft in for mine, but I did drop the center bearing. Once we've done that, we can start taking these nuts off the exhaust. There's 3 nuts. They're pretty easy to get to with a long extension on a 3/8 rattle gun or even a 1/2 inch. Maybe hit them with a bit of CRC first. They may be a bit rusted on. Then there's 2 bolts at either end here for my particular exhaust anyway, so we can take that off. If you have the original exhaust, you may still have the EGR pipes going to your exhaust. Make sure you take them off. That'll help with getting them test pipes down. While doing them exhaust, just have a look. There is an earth sitting on the top of the transmission here. It's on the left-hand side of the vehicle. In my case, you do need a wobbly socket and a long extension to get that bolt out of the transmission in order to remove that earth. You may be able to do it while you lift the engine. You may not. I'm not sure, but I took it off there. The oil pressure sensor, it has a boot covering it up, and there's just simply a plug to remove. The engine mounts is just 1 nut on either side of the engine. I believe they were 17mm. There's also a bolt here on the power steering rack. Make sure you take that bolt out because the thread will get in the way of the sump when you go to lift the engine. It's good to get the extra clearance on the sump and not damage your sump on that bolt. Now, when it comes to getting the engine slinged up, now I'm putting slings over the engine because I've removed the engine mounts now and I want to take the weight of the engine. I've just put them under here through the intake manifold. That's a 2-meter 1-ton sling. And I'm going to use a very short Caterpillar lifting tag here in order to get as much height out of the engine as possible. If we have long chains, we may not get the height we need. I've also opened the bonnet a bit further and held it up. You can leave the bonnet on, you can open it a bit further and it's enough clearance to get the engine out. I'm going to support the transmission here with a jack, and I've also got the car off the ground, of course, because I need to get under there occasionally to remove some stuff. And of course, I need clearance for the engine crane as well. Now I've taken the load on the crane. You can see, just making sure there's no hoses or anything in the way. We're going to give it a shake backwards and forwards. Make sure the sump is clearing that power steering rack and make sure that the transmission is coming out of the slip joint in the tail shaft. Now, if you're taking the tail shaft out, it's probably much better idea, but I left it in and it did slide out. Just make sure you have that center bearing dropped. It will make life much easier. Of course, my alternator is still attached here as well, and we'll deal with that in a bit. Make sure them oil cooler lines are free. Make sure no plugs or anything are left connected. I might have left a couple of bits and pieces here just to unplug. I think that's the oxy sensor I'm unplugging there. And there is a couple of brackets for them earths. Just make sure we take them bolts out as we go on both sides of the engine. There are brackets there you just won't get to until you've got the engine on the hoist. You can do that there. That's no big deal. Just make sure we don't forget to undo those. Now here's the alternator. We're going to deal with the alternator now. We can either unplug all the harness out of the back of the alternator, or in my case, I'm just going to take the bolt and the nut out of the alternator and drop it out of the way. Now the tranny is hitting the tunnel here. Now I've had to lift the front of the engine a bit higher, and I've used a little come along in order to do that. I've just hooked it up to the top radiator hose solid line, just taking a little bit of weight to tilt the engine back enough to get the tranny to drop where I've lifted it. it's not dropping the back of the tranny enough. So I've put a hoist on there, just a little lever hoist you can see there, with a chain just to lift the front of the engine a little bit more while we hoist it out. And there's the engine out, ready for rebuild. Thank you very much for watching.